So, my presentation is on memorials as encapsulation of stories of peoplehood and their forms of nationalism, and I think that there's no better way to encapsulate that than through a little recent story. So, in the last month from Selma, Georgia, the Jefferson Davis chair was stolen by an organization named White Lives Matter. And White Lives Matter conditioned the return of this chair on the basis that the United Daughters of the Confederacy, put a banner outside of their headquarters in Richmond, Virginia that says, a quote from a black liberation activist that says, "The rulers of this country have always valued property more than lives." And we can see that they did not meet these conditions as the chair was turned into a toilet. So, that is the current statement I'm trying to make. Memorials are more than just concrete stone statues. They mean something deeper, and it doesn't mean that they're toilets. It means that Confederate statues have a deep meaning to them that's more than just veiled civic language in it that values this Republican patriot that loved slavery of the South. I mean, that's the last part is important. They loved slavery. It's not that they were some civic nation that you can just uphold. The ethnic domination is at the very root of it. And even though some memorials might not make direct racial claims in them, they are still at the basis ethnic domination, and that's why White Lives Matter, or White Lies Matter, my apologies, felt the need to do this. This is a comical approach, but they actually really touch on something important here. One of their quotes say, "Confederate monuments exist to show people whose freedom was won through civil strife and spilled in blood, that there is a portion of the country willing to spill more blood to ensure that equality given to blacks never occurs." So, there's other Confederate monuments that we explain later that talk about how, despite that we lost the war in it, they describe, oh, we're still glad that we died, and the cold hands that bore the Confederate flag are fine with having died for the cause. It's this collective immortality that's inside of the Confederacy, and that's a notion of Republican nationalism, but in it is ethnic domination. So one of the objects of this paper is to show the limitations of nationalism in a pluralistic democracy, and what I just said, how civic nationalism, like Republican nationalism, can actually forward a system of domination, even though it doesn't explicitly say it. So one of the ways that I try to go through memorials and then examine whether they're good or bad is to establish an ideal, and that I do from the work of Roger Smith and Stories of Peoplehood. And with an ideal, then we can say whether something is defensible or indefensible. So, since this is a study of nationalism, it's useful to go through what a definition of nationalism is. The term nationalism generally is used to describe political movements that seek state power and political independence. However, it can be used to describe a variety of terms. Most important here for us is the process of people making, or the process of state formation. It's a link to what Smith calls the process of people making, and why it's crucial here is we're looking at memorials as tools used by political leaders in order to forge a peoplehood. So that's how memorials link in to nationalism. So Smith provides three main stories of peoplehood, and stories of peoplehood are the justifications for a people having come together, and you can also see these stories of peoplehood being used by nationalist leaders in order to motivate their movement. So if we look at political power stories, it talks about the rights that are given to all people in the community and the representation they might receive. That's seen in the Declaration of Independence. We need to leave the crown because we need our own personal rights and representation. Economic stories also seen in Declaration of Independence. We need to leave the crown because we need to make money and screw the king and his taxes. And lastly, ethically constitutive stories. Now, these are the most dangerous but also the most important to meaning in your life. Ethically constitutive stories can be religious, gendered, or ethnic. Now, if you think about it, your religious community might be the most important thing to your life. Your marriage might be the most important thing to your life. Your cultural heritage might be the most important thing to your life. These things are all wrapped up integrally into your identity, but they can't be particularly forwarded through the national government. At this point, it becomes domination when particular stories, particularly ethically constitutive stories that should only apply to individuals and individual communities, are adopted as a national identity. So, what Smith forwards as a defensible account of peoplehood and the stories that constitute it is to take these ethically constitutive stories and then provide a peoplehood that can have ethically constitutive stories exist but not occur in which domination happens. So, the way you do this is that you allow for a politics of contestation in which political constitutive, I think I've been saying constitutive all this time, but it's constitutive. Okay, I read too much and don't talk enough. Anyway, what we want is an environment in which ethically constitutive stories basically combat against one another. That it's an environment in which all of these particular communities might disagree on a wide range of things, but they agree on a certain universal basis. So let's say that there's a society in which there's a wide variety of religious groups. Each religious group would have to acknowledge that there's a human right to freedom of religion. That way, these communities can moderate each other, exist with one another, and have a principle by which they don't violate. Looks like I'm running short on time, but hold on. So, I want to talk briefly about the myth of the civic nation. You don't live in a civic nation. No one's ever lived in a civic nation. No purely civic nation has ever existed. Like, you might want to think of the United States as a civic nation, but it's not. If we were a civic nation, we would be able to just switch our membership over to places like France or Canada because they also have liberal civic ideals, but we don't. And the reason why we can't just identify as French is that we have different ancestral and cultural heritage. We're just not the same. We might like to think our main basis is civics, but we don't think we're French just because we might have a similar government structure. That's not how it works. So indefensible characters of Republican nationalism. This is important here because, as we talked about before, the Confederate statues have these ideas of collective immortality that are dangerous, and that comes from Republican nationalism. It's similar to civic nationalism because it only forwards stories of political power and economics. However, that's not true. They still forward ethical stories, but they just say they don't. And then they have similarities with an ethnic nation because they emphasize this collectivity and this love for patria, or patriot, whatever. Anyway, it's this collectivity that's an issue. It says, so ethnic nationalism says everyone around you in this community were blood siblings. But in a Republican nation, we're civic siblings. There's barely a difference in between it, and it makes these strong bonds and obligations that can make individuals do crazy things, like racial domination. Anyway, we're going to get to our first memorial here, and it's the shrine dedicated to Adrastos. And this dates back to about 600 to 500 BC, and unfortunately this picture is just a generic shrine to a hero, as it was a substantial long time ago. I could not get a picture of it myself. But anyway, the story goes from Herodotus' histories, who likes to usually tell a moral story that the king Cleisthenes of Sicyon declared war on Argos, but he didn't only do that, he basically declared a war on the entire ethnicity of Argos. And in doing so, when he was preparing for war, he decided he needed to cleanse his society of every memorial that had a trace of Argive ancestry in it. And one of those was the shrine to Adrastos, who was a Greek hero of Sicyon. He was actually a descendant of one of the early kings of Sicyon. However, the King Cleisthenes tried to remove any references to that. And the way that he forwarded ethnic domination through seemingly civic enterprises of organizing how his state memorials work is that he transferred all the sacrifices that were due to Adrastos to a Theban hero named Melanippos. And Melanippos was the one who had killed Adrastos' brother in combat and was his mortal enemy. So what King Cleisthenes did is that he identified that the ideal for a Sicyonian is someone who has killed an Argive. And so that is an example of a civic activity like state memorials that is in fact domination. And then we will move back to a Confederate example, and this one is riddled with issues. This is the Anderson Confederate monument. It was erected in 1902. It was started, I had my own timer on. Yep, I'm finishing up on this one. So this is the Anderson County Confederate Monument, established in 1902, and the reason why it's important is for its civic language that obviously employs domination. So the first line says, "Though conquered we adore it, love the cold dead hands that bore it." So nothing in this says anything about racial domination, but it shows the Republican and ethic notion of collective immortality. The Confederates were willing to die just to show how committed they were to their lifestyle. What they were committed to and why they were fine with dying, and the cold hands that bore the Confederate flag loved it, is that they wanted to maintain an immortal legacy of a virtuous slave state, like the Spartans or all the rest. It makes sense to them. And then the second line here says, "The world shall decide in truth's clear, far off light, that the soldiers who wore the gray and died with Lee were in the right." So, what were the Confederates in the right about? The next line helps to explain this. "The spirit of chivalry did not die in 1861 when the Confederacy set forth to battle for their love of home, country, and the preservation of constitutional liberty." So what were they fighting for? Constitutional liberty. Sounds like a super civic term. However, it's not. It implies domination. Constitutional liberty means that certain states have the right, because they are so esteemed that they can infringe on the liberties of an entire portion of their population, meaning that constitutional liberty means that certain states have the right to slavery, and therefore somewhat of a civic term is actually very much ethnic domination, displayed at the center of Anderson County, in front of, I think, a courthouse still today. So, and that is it.